Hello, students. In this lecture, we'll talk about communication. This is an introduction to communication. We've got a couple lectures on communication, but when we focus on social behaviors and the evolution of social behaviors, communication is critical, or animals need to communicate with each other in order for any kind of social behaviors to really take place. So let's take a look at our PowerPoint slide. Lecture 12, Communication. Notice that there's not much to read for this particular lecture. So we'll take a look, we'll introduce the topic, we'll take a look at what is communication, what are the functions of communication, and then we'll talk about some things that aren't communication, we don't think. So we'll start here. You may have watched at one point in your life the movie called Genie. It's based on a little girl whose pseudonym is Jeannie, and this little girl became the subject of pretty intense study, really, in the 1970s. So Jeannie grew up in the 1960s and lived with her parents for her first 13 years of life. But her dad was incredibly abusive, and abusive in a really awful way. He kept her in a very small room for all 13 years of her life. She was in like a 10 by 10 room in the crib at night, and she was, remember, 13, and tied to a potty chair during the day. He didn't talk to her. No one came into the room. He said a few words to her. He growled at her like a dog. When he was mad at her. She was finally so-called rescued by her mom, who finally took her out of the situation. And then she moved to a number of foster homes and grew up from there. But scientists were in some ways weirdly excited about this situation because she had very little language or vocabulary, and the question was, can she learn to communicate with language? Is she too old for language development? And researchers were really asking the question, does language development have a critical period? A time in which you can learn language, but then a time in which it's too late to learn language. And so she became kind of the object of intense study. What happened to her? How did she, did she develop language? So she had a vocabulary of about 20 words, mostly negative words, when she was 13. And she went to a series of foster homes in which they tried to teach her all sorts of things, right? Language development, social skills, everything, right? And she never really learned language. She never understood the grammatical structure of language and couldn't use the grammar of language. She did increase her vocabulary, right? So she could communicate with words, but she didn't get the details of grammar. So in this first paragraph, you can see she would say words like applesauce by store. And, the message is, we need to go to the store to buy applesauce, or you need to go to the store to buy applesauce, perhaps. But she didn't say that, and she didn't learn that. And so researchers kind of concluded that the learning of language as a form of communication has a critical period. You can't learn the rules of grammar so late. You have to learn them earlier in your life. In any case, she was phenomenal at nonverbal communication. So there's all sorts of stories about her getting her way without ever saying a word, about people seeing her and buying gifts for her in the store, about a little boy walking by her at a store and he had a fire truck and he just gives it to her. So she was very good at nonverbal communication, but couldn't develop the grammar of language. In any case, you should watch the movie if you're a little bit more interested in. But this little girl is just a way that I wanted to introduce the topic of communication, because clearly speech and language are a primary mechanism by which humans communicate, but all animals communicate. So how do you define what communication is? What do you think it is? I've got a couple of examples or a couple of definitions. Communication may be an act by one organism that alters the behavior of another organism, such that they both benefit. Okay, an act produced by one organism, the signaler, that alters the behavior of another organism, the receiver, such that the signaler and the receiver can benefit. Another way to say this would be it's a transfer of information from a signaler to a receiver so that the signaler and sometimes the receiver benefits. The transfer of information from a signaler to a receiver so that the signaler, the one doing the communicating, benefits. Okay, this kind of communication is often very species specific. It's stereotyped sometimes. It's intense. Okay. So we can think of obvious examples of communication, right? A male bird singing a courtship song is trying to communicate to a female bird about his, who he is, and about his presence, about his desire to mate with her, if you will, right? But there are some other forms of messages that I'm not sure if they count as communication. So let's think about a few problems, if you will, with our definition of communication. Or let's think about some situations in which we have to say, is this communication or not? So think about this. Do both the signaler and the receiver have to benefit? Or is it just the signaler that has to somehow benefit? So here's an example of what might be considered communication. Probably not. There are these femme fatale fireflies, these predaceous female fireflies that will, and remember, fireflies are the ones that blink a flash of light at night during the summer, if you've seen them. These predaceous female fireflies sometimes send mate attraction signals to another species. So they send out a flash pattern that attracts males from another species. So the male flies in thinking, I'm going to get to mate tonight. And guess what happens? The female eats the male when he arrives. So the male loses out entirely. He doesn't get to mate, and he's dead. Is this a type of communication? Would you call this communication? The signaler benefits. The receiver is hosed. I think most people would call this some sort of deceit, using communication to deceive. Is it communication? Possibly, yeah. What about this one? Does the signal have to be intentional? So this happens a lot in the fish world. If you're in a school or a shoal of fish, one fish will find food. A minnow finds the food and begins to eat it and is going about its merry way. Other minnows see the fish eating and follow it to food. Does that count as communication? Because the signaler, the original minnow, didn't really intentionally say, hey, there's food over here, come on over, guys. Is this communication? I'm not sure. What about this? Can communication occur between different species? Probably going to have to go with yes on this one. Think of a dog. And dogs use a play bow before playing with other dogs often, right? Where they stick their tail up, their rump up and their tail's wagging and their front paws are down low. They'll do this for you too. They'll do this with you when they want you to play with them. So I think that communication can extend between species. Well, what about this situation? Think about this. There are these frogs called Tungara frogs, that in these frogs, the male, and this is very typical for frogs, the male will make a call to attract females to mate. And big males tend to make lower, louder calls, and females like that. But the Tungara frogs have kind of a complicated call. But sometimes when they're calling, there are predators, little insects actually, mites that fly to them and find them when they're calling, or even some sort of bird predator, I can't remember, or is it an owl, that will hear the call and be attracted to that Tungara male frog and prey upon it. Is that communication? It's using communication. I mean, it's kind of there seem to be a form of communication, because the Tungara frog is the signaler and clearly signaling his intent to a female, but it's intercepted by a predator. So these are some examples of how communication is kind of sticky. It's kind of messy. So what are the requirements for communication? Here's a picture that I took when we were out in Yellowstone National Park. We got up early and we hunted for the wolf pack. There are several wolf packs to watch in Yellowstone, and we found one, and there were lots of other spectators watching them, and we watched them for 2 or 3 hours. But when I think about a wolf marking its territory, much like a dog would, what are the requirements for communication? Is this a type of communication? Yes, I think it is. But here are the requirements. You need a source. So you need a signaler, someone doing the communicating, a destination, a receiver. Okay, so in this case, we've got one wolf marking his territory to tell other wolves something. You need a channel. So how is the signal sent? Well, it's sent by olfaction. You need the specific mechanism or the code. And I guess here we would say the animals were using pheromones, chemical signals, and olfaction is the way to detect those chemical signals. And the message is clear here, it's stay away. And the context in which this message is said is probably stay away because this is my territory, and you're not supposed to come in my territory. So we've got the requirements for communication in a wolf marking its territory. What are some of the characteristics of signals? I've got a whole bunch of them here. First of all, a signal can either be discrete or graded. A discrete signal is a hard onset signal that goes on and off, like talking or auditory signals, a call, a wolf howl, auditory signals are very much discrete. Or a graded onset, a soft onset. Pheromones are graded signals. Facial expressions in humans and non-human primates are graded signals. Visual signals can be too. Distance and duration is important. So some signals have a very short distance, right? A visual signal is often a very short range signal, right? Or could be very long range. So auditory, olfactory signals tend to be much longer range. You can hear that wolf howl from a long way away, but can't see what it's doing. The duration of the signal, again, it can be something that lasts a really long time, like the antlers on male elk last all season long, or the brightly colored feathers in a goldfinch, a male goldfinch, that last for the season. Or it could be very short, like the visual displays in a courtship behavior. And you see a male cardinal courting a female cardinal, short visual displays. The signal could be a composite signal. In other words, you could have multiple signals combining together, and sometimes for a new meaning. But let's think about three-spine stickleback. the male stickleback develop this bright red body coloration during the whole breeding season, and then they do a series of courtship dances when a female appears. So they have the coloration, they have the dance that they do. Both of those are visual signals combined to say, hey, I'm courting you. I'm attractive, you should mate with me, right? The context is always important. Sometimes the same signal can have different meanings in different contexts. Absolutely. So this beautiful dance that the males do for females in three-spine stickleback, the male will swim up to the female and do these kind of alternate darts going back and forth. We call them zigzags because they're look like they're zigzagging in the water to show off their colors and maybe to show off their quality to the potential mate, right? Well, when I was doing research with stickleback, I noticed that males will also do those very same zigzag dance moves to males, to other males, their rivals. And so this signal for a rival might mean, hey, watch out. I'm big, I'm strong, I'm high quality, and this is my territory. It may have a different meaning when it's presented to a male versus to a female. And then there's the meta-communication. This is always the fun one, communicating about communication. And one display can sometimes change the meaning of those that follow it. So again, think about a play bow in dogs, right? A dog will do a play bow and then it will act apparently aggressive, right? Chasing and growling and biting. But because it's done the play bow, the other dogs recognize, oh, this is just a play act. It's not real aggression. It's not real. It's not real aggression. It's play. So one signal changes the meaning of other behaviors or other communications. Okay, and then there are channels of communication. How do animals communicate? What are the channels? And think of the benefits and drawbacks of each channel. So you can come up with these channels yourself, but let's think of a few. The obvious ones are auditory, right? Auditory are long-range signals. They're good, say, at night. They're pretty easy to locate, but they cost a lot. It takes a lot of energy to howl or to sing if you're a bird. Chemical signals. They're also very long range. They're okay at night. They have slow transmission though, and they're hard to locate. But they don't have a lot of cost. They're pretty easy to make. And you know that from walking your dog around the neighborhood. How many times does he stop and leave his mark, if you will? Super low cost way to signal, hey, this is my territory. A visual signal is a lot different. A visual signal is short range, maybe medium range, sometimes long range. It just depends on like the environment in which the signal is made. It's definitely fast transmission, but it's not good at night. It can't flow around barriers. Like chemical signals can flow around barriers, so can auditory signals. But it is easy to locate the sender, right? And it's high cost as well. It's expensive to produce the behavior or to produce the color for a visual signal, for example, costs a lot. A tactile communication, touch, right? It's very short range, has fast transmission. It works well at night or during the day. It's easy to locate, not too high a cost, but you can't flow around barriers, so it's not going to be a long-range signal that you're using it for. There are lots of other ways of communication that are much more rare, like electric communication. There are fish, for example, that can communicate by sending out electrical signals, and they even have specific different signals, each individual fish. So members of the population can identify individuals by their form of communication. Lots of others as well, but those are the big ones. All right, in the next video we'll focus on the functions of communication. And I will sort my way out of this.